Okay, well, we are about 6 minutes after, so I think we'll go ahead and start. Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Falloon, and on behalf of the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies, welcome to our second Food for Thought seminar. Inspired by the traditional CES Friday lunch, the seminar brings together our community to discuss an array of topics related to European food, wine, and culture. We are delighted to host our two guests today, both of whom were visiting scholars at CES during the 2016-17 academic year. Our speaker, Elizabeth Carter, also known as Betsy, is joining us from New Hampshire, and our chair of the discussion, Alexandra Soika, is joining us from Spain. This seminar is meant to be engaging and inclusive. We encourage you to have your cameras on and microphones muted unless you are speaking. Grab something to eat or drink, perhaps a glass of vino, and enjoy the discussion. Without further ado, Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura, for this introduction, and thanks so much for everybody for joining in. I think this is going to be a very interesting talk by Betsy. So I would like to, yes, my name is Alexandra Soika. I'm here in Madrid, in Spain, at Carlos III University in Madrid. And as Laura already mentioned, I have had the pleasure to be a visiting scholar at CES about 4 years ago. So it is wonderful really to be able to have this experience of seeing again everybody kind of getting a bit of that energy of the Friday lunches with this Food for Thought series of talks. And I don't think we could have a better person to give a talk about food and about these issues with a perspective on Europe than Betsy Carter, our speaker today. Betsy and I met, as Laura already mentioned, we met as visiting scholars at CES. So we actually had Friday lunches together, which was great. So I'm really happy to be here introducing her and then acting as a moderator in the discussion after her talk. Betsy is an assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire. She has a PhD in political science from Berkeley. And she has been a researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany, as well as a Fulbright visiting professor here in Madrid at Carlos III University. She is where her research investigates the politics or the political construction of taste and value in food, wine, fashion, music. And today she will be actually talking about her research on wine markets. Her research has appeared in journals such as Socioeconomic Review, European Journal of Sociology, and other journals and edited volumes. So she is really, I think, there's no better person to talk about wine and wine politics than Betsy. So without further ado, I give the floor to Betsy, and thank you so much for being here with us.
So first, Alexandra, thank you so much for that very generous and warm introduction. Thank you, Laura, for your introduction as well. Thank you to CES for hosting this wonderful series. As Alexandra mentioned, I too have great memories of the Friday lunches, and given COVID, this is a great way to kind of bring that spirit of the Friday lunches to the community. So I really appreciate that. And of course, thank you for the audience for being here and for your willingness to learn a little bit today, hopefully, about European wine markets and especially about French wine, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today. So I think I'm able to share my screen with you all. So let me go ahead and bring up a PowerPoint. Let's see.
So maybe I will just take this second to remind everybody to mute their microphones if they haven't done so. And also I will be moderating the discussion afterwards. So if you have any questions, you can keep them for the end of Betsy's talk, and then we will have a general Q&A. Thank you so much.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about European wine politics. And European wine politics, this was initially the focus of my dissertation, especially comparative French and Italian wine politics. I will add that it was not bad research. I was able to spend several summers and over an academic year in 11 different regions of France and Italy, just speaking to producers and speaking to people at the Ministry of Agriculture, speaking to some of the main regulators, and figuring out how these markets worked, why they were different, and what shaped these markets. So today, just given our time constraints, I'm really just going to focus on French producers and especially French quality producers. But I do want to flag here that if people want to talk about Italy or also about Germany, where I did some research as a postdoc, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do research in the wine market because COVID hit as I was doing my Fulbright there. So it's an excuse to come back to Spain. But we are going to be focusing on France. And overall, I said I went to 11 regions in France and Italy, over 100 interviews, and I'm really hoping that I tell a story that resonates with the truth of how the wine markets work, which I think I do. So a main question that we want to ask here is, why do regulated French producers still dominate the high end of the market, right? As you guys know, great wines are made throughout the world. Actually, in the US, you have grapes that are grown for wine in 49 out of 50 states, right? Maybe some of you remember or have heard of the Judgment of Paris. This was the 1976 blind tasting of wines, California wines and French wines. It was meant to commemorate, of course, the bicentennial of the US. And these unknown California winemakers swept the competition. And I should also add that the judges were French wine journalists, right? So California winemakers won, right? So you can have not just wine grown anywhere, but you can have great wines grown anywhere. Yet French producers singularly dominate the high end of the market. And our goal today is to figure out why. So here's a little bit of data. I have to back up this claim that the French dominate. Grapes in parts of France can sell for up to $4 per pound, or to use the European measurements, €6.10 per kilo, right? €6.10 per kilo. And within that, we can actually have the AOC, and I'm going to talk more about the AOC in this presentation, but basically that designates the regulated quality market for champagne, can sell as high as 20, or the average actually, it's 21.34 per liter, right? If we look at regulated quality French wines overall and take champagne out, because champagne is an outlier, it's actually 5.59 per liter. And the closest competitor is Italian wine producers, but they're significantly less, right? This is not a small difference in the prices. So I want, hopefully, to explain today why the AOC continues to be successful. And I'll add, the DOC actually formally has the exact same rules as the AOC. The AOC was started in 1919, the DOC in 1998. The AOC works in a way that the DOC doesn't. And actually, that's what my dissertation was about. Okay. So a little bit of background. As Alexandra mentioned, I did my PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and I see that my advisor, John Zeisman, is here. Thank you, John. And my very first interview was actually with the Wine Institute in San Francisco. And the Wine Institute is basically the lobby organization for California winemakers. And I went in and I said, I'm going to go to France. Tell me what your opinion is about quality French winemakers. And he said, oh, France is on its way out. It's an old model, and the model is inefficient, it's expensive, and it prevents French wine producers from responding to changes in demand. And actually, these things are true on the surface. And actually, if you read about some of the trends of the last 20 years in wine, there's something called the sideways effect. Maybe some of you saw the movie Sideways, right? So the sideways effect, maybe you guys remember that Merlot was really seen as a bad grape, and Pinot Noir was kind of the, the grape that refined people consumed. And after Sideways was released, there was this huge increase in demand of Pinot Noir, right? With the French wine regulation, you can't actually change the grape that you use in your wine if you produce something with the appellation d'origine contrôlée. So if there's this massive increase in demand of Pinot Noir, too bad, right? So all of these things about the AOC are true. So this actually makes it even weirder, even stranger, that they continue to dominate the market. Okay, so I imagine that people who are watching this today have different levels of knowledge about wine. So I just wanted to really quickly to say a couple of things so everyone can get up to speed. I have here 2 bottles. I have on the left a bottle of French AOC wine, and on the right I have a bottle of American wine. Okay, and for those of you who are American, who maybe are not necessarily wine connoisseurs, maybe you like to drink wine though, you most likely order wines based on grape, right? So you probably recognize Merlot, Chardonnay, Cabernet, right? All of these grapes. And in the US, right, if you are a grower in Napa Valley, you can grow any of these grapes, right? And actually we will recognize, you can, in Napa Valley, you can use any kind of grape, and you're gonna be sold based by the place, but also by the vineyard name, which we see here on the bottle. Then we look over actually at the French AOC, and the thing that we see most prominent is the place name, right? We don't see the grape at all. And actually with the place name, you are limited in which grapes you can produce. And actually the place name is more dominant than the brand, because the place name conveys a type of quality guarantee, right? Because there is, what grapes are in there, and actually how the grapes, how they are planted, how they are picked, all of this is actually restricted and determined by the regulation. So you can be a tiny producer in a region, and people are going to know what that wine will taste like because you have the place name, right? So to make this concrete, champagne, you guys go and you buy a champagne, you know what a champagne is going to taste like, right? You know it's going to be Chardonnay, that it's going to be fizzy, right? You have a Saint-Emilion, that's going to taste like. And actually one way that they regulate this, in addition to codifying production practices, they even have independent panels that taste these wines blindly to make sure that they fit a certain profile, right? So this, again, this is the French model. It's very unique. And in California, I say Napa Valley, that you might think of quality, but you don't think of any particular taste, right? Because anything can be grown in Napa that will grow in Napa. So these are really different models. Okay, so remember, our question is, why do French producers still dominate the market? And according to my interviews, definitely the dominant answer from producers, and also from people from the Ministry of Agriculture and the organization called the INAO, which basically protects producers, they all say that French producers dominate the market because they have better wine. And they say they have better wine because they have better terroir, right? So what is terroir? You guys may recognize the word terroir with the word terra, or earth. But terroir is this idea of these geographic and climatic conditions, plus this idea of what they call traditional best practice, right? This idea of production know-how. And it's an idea that only over time can you figure out, with the climate, with the soil, with the slope, which grapes really work in an area, and how those grapes are going to be maximized, and how that's going to be tilled, right? So the idea that French producers dominate the market because they have the land, but they also have generations of knowledge to build upon. So you can have great wines in California, but that doesn't really mean that those are the appropriate wines. They just don't have the depth of knowledge, right? So according to most actors in France, this is the advantage to the French, and this is their comparative advantage. Here's a really quick little graphic of terroir, just to make clear what I just said: climate, soil, terrain, tradition, right? This is, I should say, this is also the reason I was saying, right, with the former slide, that if you're making an AOC wine, it has to come right from a certain place, and it has to be certain grapes. So this is the idea, right? If you're making a champagne, 100% of the grapes have to be from Champagne. Why? It's because this idea of terroir, because the know-how, soil, everything in Champagne is unique. If you buy an American champagne, that's not Champagne. Champagne has to be from this region, right? And the consequence of this is it actually gives the growers there a monopoly, right? Because if you are a house in Champagne, you have to buy your grapes from these growers. They are not subject to competition outside the region. Okay, so this is the part where I did hear some French when people were logging in, and this is the part of the presentation that tends to be disagreeable with some francophones and francophiles. So some of you are going to have questions with this slide, especially. I apologize, but I welcome the questions. And I'm going to try to maybe push back a little bit on this idea of terroir, but just a little bit, not completely. Okay, so terroir, it is a really old concept. That's true. But actually, to say that terroir historically means the same thing it does today, that's not true. One thing we can definitely say about the meaning of terroir is it's really evolved and changed, and it's been historically unstable, okay? So one of the earliest times we can see a reference to this in a dictionary is in the middle of the 16th century. At that time, it has a very pejorative connotation. And actually, we can see a pejorative connotation as recently as the middle of the 20th century with this term terroir, right? It could be a wine that was something was off. We also see that it's an earthy flavor. It can be an artificial flavor. There's actually a time in the middle of the 19th century that it actually is akin to communion, right? This idea that if you consume something from a place, it's a spiritual experience of the place, right? So actually, we only see the current consistent use of terroir, as I just defined it, after this 1976 tasting, when it became clear that California wines could compete on quality, and there was a shift towards France having superior history and traditional best practice production, in addition to climate and these other things. Some of the literature I've read by anthropologists had Geneviève Thiel is a French woman at INRA in France, and she has this great quote where she says, terroir is something that is experienced by wine connoisseurs, it's experienced by producers, it's experienced by wine lovers, it's experienced by sommeliers, wine journalists, but it's not experienced by science. Right? And actually, scientific literature, the word terroir is in less than 5% of the scientific literature. And when it does appear, it tends to be negative, right? So people experience it, but there's no proof of that. And how can we make sense of that? So my argument, my hypothesis number 2, which I'm going to tell you here is what I think is correct, is that the French actually, I would say they do have a comparative advantage. But their comparative advantage is not in their land per se, or even this traditional best practice production. It's not in their terroir. Their comparative advantage is a result of their institutions. It's a result of their politics. And I would go so far as to argue that's actually not anti-French wine. It's actually much more difficult to replicate successful institutions and the levels of trust and a sense of belonging that make institutions effective. This is much more difficult to replicate than to find a piece of land that has good drainage and good sunlight, and to find someone with skills to work the land. So I'm not saying the French don't have a comparative advantage. I'm saying actually the comparative advantage might actually be deeper and more than what they're giving themselves credit for, because these institutions, as I said in the beginning, the same institutions are replicated in Italy. You can't take institutions and implement them somewhere else and expect them to have the same results. It doesn't work. So here's actually a photo from this Judgment of Paris, 1976. If you guys are interested, there's a great movie and book about this event called Bottle Shock, which I highly recommend. But a question then, right? Well, does terroir matter at all? Well, why did I waste like 10 minutes of your time talking about terroir? Okay, so terroir, I think actually at the end of the day is important. Okay, so I say, right, terroir may or may not be true. Actually, I think that that's not consequential. But what matters to me is belief in terroir, right? Belief in terroir changes the power dynamics in the supply chain. It changes how producers produce. It gives producers something to believe in. It provides a sense of identity. And the impact, the consequence of terroir actually ends up being wines that are produced differently, that taste differently, and that are then seen as evidence of terroir. And these wines earn higher prices. And these are why people love French wines. So maybe there's terroir, maybe not, but the belief in terroir makes these changes. I just threw a whole lot at you there, and I apologize. I'm going to try to disaggregate that tiny bit in the next couple of slides, and again, you know, I love Q&A, and I love that you guys will have, most of this presentation will be Q&A, so you guys can ask questions about some of these things I'm about to present. So for me to demonstrate the things I just threw at you, I think I need to explain two things, and I'm going to try to do them quickly because we only have like 15-20 minutes. The emergence of French institutions, and again, I could talk about this more in the Q&A, and why these institutions that emerge provide French producers with a competitive advantage or a comparative advantage. Okay, so quickly, the emergence of the French wine model. I just want to make a few of these points. If we need to pick a point in time where we think about understanding these institutions that emerged in 1919, that's when we see the birth of the AOC, we actually need to go back in time a little bit further, and actually we need to go back to the middle of the 19th century, into the Industrial Revolution in France. And there's a wonderful historian named Eugene Weber, and he says, the Industrial Revolution was more revolutionary on the lives of French producers and French peasants than the French Revolution, right? We think of the French Revolution being a time of upheaval throughout France. He says, actually, at least in the countryside, which was much more revolutionary, was the Industrial Revolution. I see a hand. I think we're going to wait and take questions at the end, if that's okay. So maybe, Alexander, if you want to make a note of whose hands, okay. So there's this massive economic displacement. And at this time, maybe some of you, perhaps if there are any historians in the house, you guys might be aware of what we call the modernist historians, Eric Hobsbawm, Benedict Anderson, Ernest Gellner, some of these other thinkers, right? They point out the importance of for notions of national identity and group identity. And it's at this time that we begin to see in France this myth of the noble peasant and the idea of terroir as a link to French past, French history, and the authentic France, right? Some of you also may be aware, if you study French industry, that French labor unions are very divided. And actually, we see divisions if we look across Catholic countries. We talk about the division between the red and the white, right? Not red and white wines, but actually communist and Catholic factions, right? And this is something that pervades France. However, in the countryside, with this myth of the French peasant and this idea of terroir and a link to identity, these divisions were overcome. And these grape growers became very powerful right? When they faced economic displacement, which they certainly did with the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because you had railroads that made grape transportation much easier. People used to have kind of de facto monopolies because you could only buy, if you were in Champagne, you could only kind of buy grapes, you know, and from a certain area just because of transportation. All of a sudden, transportation was easier, it was quicker, it was cheaper, the markets were more competitive, producers were dislocated, right? And this provided them the ability to come together to create strong organizations and institutions and to force a bargain with the people in the supply chain who bought the grapes, right? So you have the grape growers who were able to force a bargain with the wine merchants that buy their grapes. And this led to a more equal distribution of supply chain power. Okay, so I have a little picture of this, and again, I'm trying not to get too detailed because I know that this could be a part where I lose some people, so it could be a little boring. But really quickly, I want to really
check this out. This is more interesting. I just got back in.
Someone needs to mute their mic. There we go. Okay. Okay, so there's two things I want to emphasize here. The first is, as you guys probably know, France is known to be really, has a really top-down structure. Right? We can think of, you know, estatisme, dirigisme, statism, all of this. Paris directs the industries. The interesting thing about wine is it's the opposite. The power is located with the wine merchants and the grape growers, and they actually set the agenda for the state. How does this happen? So the wine merchants and the grape growers, they split power 50-50 in local councils where they make rules and regulations over how wine will be produced, right? With these institutions, the grape growers are given these monopolies. In exchange for the monopolies, you guys might be like, why do the wine merchants give the grape growers monopolies? In exchange for the monopolies, wine merchants are able to have greater transparency over the grapes that they use, and they also are able basically to write the instructions for growing so that they can ensure that they have a quality product. Okay, so we have these two organizations split power 50-50 in the interprofessional councils, and the presidency goes back and forth. It's a very collaborative group, and an example of this would be like the Interprofessional Council of Bordeaux, the Interprofessional Council of Burgundy, of Champagne, etc. There's something called the INAO that governs them. It's considered a quasi-public or semi-public organization, but really it's populated by these wine merchants and grape growers. And they have very little power over the interprofessional councils, but the INAO has a great deal of influence at the Ministry of Culture, and the Ministry of Agriculture does have some appointees on the INAO. And again, we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. But the most important thing here, and the thing that makes this really unique, is it empowers grape growers. It also gives the wine merchants something in exchange. Okay, so how does this support differentiated production? So as I just showed on the last slide, right, there's a power shift in the supply chain. Previously, as I mentioned, these grape growers faced a lot of price competition, right? Now they are protected, right? And there are things that come about because of that protection. So the first thing is they are protected from price competition. Price competition and quality production do not go together, right? If you are always trying to get efficiency gains, always trying to lower your price, it's very difficult to afford quality production practices. And the AOC helps them afford these practices. This does cost more, but it has the effect of encouraging wine merchants, those who blend and bottle the grape, to emphasize the uniqueness of the grape. They also, as I mentioned, they have greater transparency of the grape that they use. So in other supply chains, someone could buy a grape and they don't know as much about the origin and how it was produced. So they may be likely, or they would be more likely, to try to cover any potential grape flaws by using standardizing technologies that's available to anyone, right? They aren't going to be as likely to do this in France, and actually it wouldn't be in their advantage to do this because they have this unique grape which they know of the quality, and because they believe in terroir, they want to emphasize this difference. right? So the production differences, I argue, derive from the institutional incentives producers face. And there are a lot of great things I think about this model, right? Including their kind of an expanding or an opening up of the different types of quality wines that can be made, right? But there's also something, because they have these shared brands, right? That I mentioned, this could be, again, Champagne, Saint-Emilion, whatever. This can encourage and support the survival of small firms. You don't have to create a brand like Duckhorn Vineyards to convey quality. People can see the place name, know what that wine is going to taste like, and that could be enough of a brand guarantee, right? So this enables small firm survival in a market that's really crowded with global brands and many producers. You don't have to be a big player in France to survive. So some of the main takeaways that I want us to think about, we are talking about wine, but I want us to think about, are there lessons here that we can take from wine and apply to other sectors? And I think there are, and I want to lay some of these out here. The first is to think about how to move away, or the movement away from commodity input is about the distribution of power across market actors, right? And especially, as you guys probably are getting the sense, I'm very interested in supply chains, right? And especially, maybe the best parallel, actually, weirdly, to the French wine market is actually German industry, where that model that I showed you, where we have the growers and merchants equally in an organization, this is actually how German industry functions, right? Where labor is very strong, very protected, and they actually sit on the board with managers to make long run decisions, right? And they're able to have also protection from price-based competition. They have massive labor protections, right? I want us to think about, maybe when actors come together to solve problems, this could be a more effective solution than relying on the state to intervene or relying on the market. And this could also be a give incentive for quality production, because the structure does lead to higher prices. And when there are higher prices, there have to be innovations in production, but there are also benefits with those higher prices, as I mentioned here, and we can talk about those in the German case in the Q&A if you guys are interested. Are input factors substitutable? Are actors atomized? Or are input factors seen as valuable and differentiated? When input factors are seen as valuable and differentiated, this supports quality production, right? The know-how of, we want to talk about German industry, or the know-how of the great producer, right? Or the difference in these inputs are going to be emphasized throughout the supply chain. And also, again, it's going to prevent excessive price-based competition that could undermine quality. So it's not really about the quality product market. It's not about wine. It's not about a specific thing, but they are important dynamics within the supply chain that we need to think about if we're thinking about quality production. As I mentioned, it's not about the state having the right regulation. It's much easier for the state not to have to make these rules. The state is never going to know what is best for producers. And actually, this is part of the reason why the French came up with these organizations to begin with. It actually first came about in Champagne, because in Bordeaux, the state actually tried to intervene to solve conflicts between the growers and the wine merchants. Champagne producers were like, oh my gosh, they will destroy our quality. We need to solve this on our own, so the state doesn't want to intervene. And they did solve it on their own. And then they could present a solved problem for the state to protect. And this is now the structure that other organizations then replicated throughout France. And this is the way that the French quality market is now structured. And again, the thing I want to emphasize, it's about the balance of power across the supply chain, and it's about institutions. Institutions matter for quality. If we want to, again, kind of abstract some of the main points I have here, you guys maybe picked up that a really important thing to me is this idea of, when can groups come together? I feel like this is a really important point to bring up today politically, when everyone seems divided. Who is included, who is excluded, When are we able to overcome our differences? When can we have something to believe in that's stronger than we are and that causes us to change how we work with each other and to change how we produce and to construct fairer, more equitable institutions, right? And I would argue religious divides, ethnic divides, class divides, right? These can keep us separate, and these need to be overcome, and they can be overcome if there's something for people to believe in. So again, this is my last slide. You guys made it through. So again, just to emphasize with you all, how to take a commodity and create value. I'm arguing here institutions matter. It's not about terroir per se. It's about supply chain power and institutions. And having said that, now if you guys are interested, we can compare that to Italy, to Germany, to the US. But my goal here was to really make sure that you guys were clear on what the French advantage was. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks so much, Betsy, for a very, very interesting talk. I know we already have one question from Peter, so I will give the floor to him in just a second. I wanted to ask you, if you ask a question, if you want to ask a question to Betsy, raise your hand and I will give you the floor. And then when you ask the question, please say who you are, you know, where you are, etc. So Peter, the floor is yours. And then others, if you have a question, just please raise your hand.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I tend not to be informed about wine in such terms, and but I do have a question I think is applicable because I was wondering when I think you said at the beginning that French wines are the most expensive. Now, look, what I'm wondering about is if we accept the insanity of Romanée Conti and a couple of other Burgundies, perhaps partially the result of people taking sideways too seriously or having just too damn much money, and scarcity, of course. But there's another level down, and you know, and that's when we get to Bordeaux and a couple of other places. You know, they're not to the first growths yet. So the next level down. I mean, you know, Romanée Conti is $20,000 a bottle, and but then we have Petrus, Le Pin, and Pingos in Spain, right? And they're all in the sort of plus minus $4,000 or $5,000 range a bottle, right? So still insanity, but they have competition in other countries. In Germany, they have Egon Müller and JJ Prum, and in the United States, they have Screaming Eagle. And and then if we get down to the normal range of outrageously priced wines, yeah, then we get to Bordeaux First Growths, to a few champagnes, Salon, Cristal Rosé, things like that. But Salon, I think, goes way above Cristal Rosé. And then, yeah, we have the Bordeaux First Growths plus Cheval Blanc. But they have competition too. There's plenty of competition in the United States in that price range. There's Harlan, there's Tusk, there's Promontory, there's Bryant, all these wines that are in the sort of up to $1,000, you know, $700 to $1,000 a bottle range, and then yeah, and then in Spain you have in that same group Vega Sicilia, Unico, and stuff like that. So it seems to be in the realm of hyper-priced wine and just ridiculously priced wine. There seems to be some balance in the world between France and Spain and Germany and Italy. I forgot. Yeah, in that range is also Massetto in Italy, and then also in the United States. So how does that fact that, you know, at the high ends there's plenty of competition for France, how does that reconcile with what you're saying about French pricing?
Okay, so that's obviously you know a lot about wine. I'm very impressed by.
I have never bought any of those.
I've never tried any of them.
I don't buy any wine that costs more than $300 a bottle, and precious little of that.
I mean, you raise a great point. I feel like what you are emphasizing is actually more about the individual power of brands.
Mhm.
And that's not what I'm focusing on here. And actually, when you were speaking, I started to think it would be great if I could actually exclude those outliers. I do think that those quantities of those outliers are so constrained, which is extremely deliberate, right? And they, of course, they constrain it in order to have higher prices. But one thing that I think is interesting is how, I don't know if you've seen the movie Red, or the documentary Red about Bordeaux, and it's, you know, it's become runaway popular with the very wealthy in China. And it's interesting me to think about, well, how do the, you know, how does the success of the top houses in Bordeaux and the brand they create actually help build this secondary market for these lower wines that actually share? I think you asked these top producers, which I did. This is one of some of the great research, was actually being able to do some tasting. Probably the only time I'll ever taste some of these wines. Wonderful, you know, but I asked them, how does the AOC affect you? And for them, it's nothing, right? The AOC is, that's not something that they are responding to. But it's kind of like, you know, you have the boat and then you have the things in its wake that benefit from that first comer. So I think with the AOC, it's that they are able to take advantage of, you know, of the wake of these Bordeaux's, perhaps in ways that are not quite so salient in other contexts, such as the Napa Valley wines, where there's just not that, you know, proposed homogeneity that's guaranteed by place. And also because, again, this idea or this myth of terroir, right? You have a Chateau Petrus, we benefit from that. We are part of that history. We are part of that area. We are part of that taste. And I think because, and actually something I didn't talk about in my presentation was that I didn't meet a single French producer or a single person in the French government that didn't believe in terroir. I'm sure that there are some, but I didn't meet anyone. Where I would have interviews. For example, I was in Germany and I went to a top Riesling producer and I said, okay, is terroir real? And the guy said, turn off your tape recorder. Okay. And he said, yeah, I have different terroir under the tree in the shade than in the sun, on the slope than in the plain. He's like, I have 20 different terroirs on my small parcel of land. So don't talk to me that everything within a region has the same terroir. That's a marketing concept, right?
Well, the Germans do go very much by very tiny terroir. I mean, they really understand it that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I should have said, I'm sorry. You asked me people to introduce themselves. I'm Peter Burgard. I'm a professor of German and one of only a couple members of the Standing Committee on European Studies from the humanities.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. That's a very good point.
Yes, thanks so much, Peter. And I mean, I'm really impressed by your knowledge of these wines. I was trying to take notes.
I'm a fanatic, you know, obsessive compulsive, like all academics. It just comes out in different ways. I'll mute myself.
Thank you. Thanks so much. The next question we have Grace Baller, and again, Grace, if you could introduce yourself and then tell us what your question is.
Of course. Hi, thank you. I'm Grace Baller. I'm an economic historian currently at Harvard Business School. Thanks so much for the presentation. Great to see you and see your work developing. So I wondered if you could provide some more clarity on this relationship between the state and the market. Your research questions premised on the French quality market, as you called it, and you argue that the answer to this is not about the state versus the market, but the AOC and DOC are actually not quality designations. They're very old, in the French case, 15th century legal structures that protect geographical indications, literally the origin of the wine. So the state seems to be actively protecting certain designated producers and then also choosing winners. As a second point, I also wondered if you could situate the global success of the French wine production in the dual histories of globalization and regional economic integration. How does your story dovetail with those two wider developments? Thanks so much.
Cool. Great questions, Grace. Thank you for that. And you gave me a whole lot to work with there. So if I forget, I may come back to you or to Alexandra. Okay, so your first question was about the role of the state versus the market. And from what I understand, you seem to be claiming that there's a very strong role of the French state and that these appellations go back to, did you say the 15th century? I would say, I don't know what examples that you are referring to, but from my research, I looked extensively, where can we find the first evidence of wines being produced by appellations, right? So having a place name and a place name that was a guarantee of quality, and a place name that was a guarantee of quality and origin, right? And kind of, maybe it's something that is closest to the AOC we can see emerging in the middle of the 19th century in Burgundy, and there would be, so you would have like a Nuit Saint-Georges, and that would have a typicité, a taste, but it would not necessarily be from the producers of Nuit Saint-Georges. And there was not an idea that there was a place where producers made wine that could only be made there. This was something that was constructed when French growers began losing their markets, right? You are correct that the French state has a really important role to play. But what the French state does here, I would argue, is they're actually being tools, or they're being used, I would say, by French producers to put a stamp on what the producers say quality is. So the producers are the ones who are coming up with their cahier de charge, they are writing their best practice production, right? And there is this, the INAO, I had that flow chart. The INAO is able to guide people, guide producers through this process. And actually, increasingly, I would say that because you have mostly producers in the INAO, they are not looking to expand the AOC, right? Because that kind of deteriorates the benefit that they have. But what you have is you have the state that ends up, basically, again, having the back or giving the stamp of quality to these local organizations, these regional organizations. And then people are saying, okay, well, the French state tells us this is quality. This is something in France, it's gone back to the Sun King, right? That you have, and Norbert Elias writes about this, right? That the state says quality, and then this is replicated throughout, the ranks of society. And this is something that we can see happening with wine, that you have consumers basing their preferences off the state, but the state are defining quality based on what producers are telling them the quality is. Does that make sense? So you do have a role of the state, and it does matter, but the state is subject to the producers. They are the ones that are defining quality. And it's also, again, it's very much, it's a market where, yeah, producers say, this is quality, this is history, this is what you should like. Actually, when I was at the Max Planck for a couple of years, I never did a wine tasting. People always were telling me I should, but I had some colleagues there. They said, do a tasting so you can tell us what wines we should like, right? It's like, how about we do a tasting and you could figure out what wines you do like, right? But there is this idea that there's a proper taste, and the French producers, I think, capitalize on this. And then the other question was something, do you want to repeat your second question? It was about globalization and regionalization, is this right?
Yeah, just wondered if you could situate the story you're telling within these larger, especially economic contexts.
That's a big question. And it's hard for me to know exactly what you mean and how to interpret that. I would say in general, I'll say this. When I was doing my interviews, the thing that, I had my set of questions, and there were the things that I wanted to ask, and there were the things that producers wanted to talk about. And what producers especially wanted to talk about was the rise of the Chinese market and the importance of Chinese, how to get into China and how to educate consumers there about French. And this actually, I did interviews with luxury too, and it was the same story there. So I think with globalization, there are certain countries that have or are trying to have certain reputations, right? And they are trying to, to shape the global markets. And I think France has actually been able to do that very successfully, especially in wine, especially the high end of wine. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Thank you for those questions.
Yes, thanks so much, Grace, for these very, very interesting questions. And I do not have more people in line to ask a question. Okay, I see there is a follow-up question from Peter, but I also wanted to take that that moment to ask my own question, because if you allow me, and Betsy, I was wondering. Because I mean, we are all, of course, we are here because we're interested in wines, and we're interested in good wines, good European wines. So I was wondering, what does your research tell us about how can we actually get those good wines? Like if we are out there trying to find a wine, a good French wine, or maybe European wine, how should we, what kind of issues or what kind of indicators should we look for? Yeah, what are the pointers from your research in that terms, just to give something practical also to our participants today?
Okay, big question. I'm going to answer that a few different ways. I would say if you like quality Rieslings and quality Germans, actually quality German wines, I have a good piece of advice for you, and that's go to Whole Foods and look for the top that looks like an eagle, a little stamp. That's something called the VDP. And in my opinion, that's the most effective quality wine regulation that there is. It's not based on terroir. It's a small group of 200 quality producers, and it's really based on who makes quality wine. The wines tend to be pretty, Whole Foods, you could get them for $20. Germany, of course, it would be like half that. But this, I often will buy VDP wines. I've never had a bad one. It's a small club of wines that are good, and it works. So that would be my first advice. If you want a good French, Italian, Spanish wine, it's much harder. This is my two-tier advice, is first, figure out a vocabulary that describes the type of wine you like, right? So mine is, I like earthy, not too oaky, fresh, right? And then go to a place and talk to someone and describe what you like and describe your price point. Because honestly, the market is so crowded. I could say, hey, like I love Cab Francs, and I could tell you some regions that have great Cab Francs, but that doesn't mean that you're going to like a Cab Franc. Actually, I impose Cab Francs on a lot of my friends, and I'm surprised that they let me do that, because it's a pretty distinct taste. So the important thing for you is to figure out what you like, how to convey that, and then to find an expert that can help match you with that. And that's much better actually than, as Peter was pointing out, some of these wines are crazy expensive. And actually, when I did my interviews in Burgundy, I had this great wine. I had a teacher who was really looking out for me. I went to bring this wine to Thanksgiving, and it was 380 euro for a bottle of it. It was great, but it wasn't worth that. So find out your price point and your vocabulary and your person to ask.
Yeah.
Question.
Thanks. That's actually really useful. Peter, so I think we have time for one more, but quick question, because we're almost running out of time. So if you could, tell us what was your follow-up question there.
Yeah. I would have lots of advice to give about every price point, but my question is, I was going to bring up the VDP and also the IGT. And because the DOC, as far as I know, has not been challenged in the way that the AOC has not been challenged in France the way the DOC was challenged in Tuscany, and to the point where the DOC had to give them, in order to keep some control, had to give them a new designation, IGT. And also then in Germany, which the VDP is a revolution against the Prädikat, and I'm wondering why you think that happened in Italy and Germany, but hasn't happened in France.
That's an awesome question, and I'm really glad you asked that, and I'll try to answer really quickly. I would say the answer is in 1968, when the DOC regulation, which as I mentioned was copied from the AOC, when that was implemented in Italy, they hadn't had time to experiment to find their best production practices. And actually a lot of the rules were very political, right? So in Tuscany, you had to blend actually red and white grapes, and the grapes that were actually listed where it wasn't about, what was the best wine, which again was still being experimented, but it was who was powerful enough to be able to be protected by the regulation. And then several powerful rogue producers started breaking those rules, right? I had some great interviews, for example, at Antinori. And so, we know that these were bad rules, and we knew how to make the wine. And there, you had these producers who were experimenting. And then the crazy thing is yeah, you had table wine in Italy that was selling for astronomically high prices, and the regulated so-called quality wine. I mean, in some regions, the quality wine, people weren't even using the stickers, the DOC stickers, because the cost of the sticker was greater than the value added of having the regulation. So you had a broken system, right? And exactly the IGT regulation, which actually looks very much like the regulation that we have in California and the US, which gives flexibility to producers, was a result of, I would say, flawed practices that were codified by law. And this, producers then were able to experiment, still have a quality regulation. And of course, in the long run, we have the development of the DOCG, which why the DOC still has some problems. The DOCG has largely been very effective. The DOCG is basically the DOC with some extra tasting and some extra standards, and it's a smaller club of quality producers. So then if we talk about the origin of, and I'm sorry for all of these acronyms for people who don't know about wine, but hopefully you still get the gist of the story. The VDP in Germany, it's very, so this, the VDP and the French, sorry, the German wine hierarchy that actually was also emerging in the, I think it actually came about in the I think it was 1972. But you have basically a German regulatory structure, the state regulatory structure, this isn't the VDP, was based on ideals of the 1960s that were about meritocracy. So where France is all about hierarchy and birth, if you can make a great wine in the Languedoc, you're never going to be able to climb that ladder to be a quality wine, right? And Germany wanted to do something different. They said anyone who makes a good wine, but should be able to get the highest status, but we need to make this transparent, right? And so they have a scale that's about the measurement of sugar. Well, not all wine, this doesn't always work so well. Like there's an incentive to plant varieties that will be more sugary, right? The meritocracy, it was a good idea, but it didn't work well in practice. And the VDP actually, it had already existed prior to this structure, but I think the failure of the national regulation really opened up space for the VDP to provide a quality regulation, because the German one wasn't effective and efficient across different types of wine.
Well, it was also the turn to dry wines, and thus to the Großes Gewächs, to the Grand Crus, the Premier Crus in Germany. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, awesome question. I think that could be a good framing for a presentation in the future. That was fantastic.
Great outcome.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I think we just have just a few minutes to wrap up. So I don't know, Betsy, would you like to say a few words just to finish off your presentation and your talk?
Well, I really want to thank all of you guys for coming. And I appreciate your interest in European wines and your wonderful questions. And again, I want to thank CES for hosting this. I love the Friday lunches. I still dream of that wonderful salmon and the great conversations that we would all have. Do you remember that salmon? It was so good. But this is a wonderful way that we can gather in the absence of those in-person meetings. So thank you, CES. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Laura. Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Betsy. Thanks.
Thank you, Betsy.